Hello, everybody, and welcome to OAG's latest webinar. Good morning and good afternoon to wherever you are in the world today. Well, looking out the window here, summer is most definitely over in this part of the Northern Hemisphere, and crisp mornings and autumn skies have come our way, although that's only when it's not raining, which is quite a lot here. So today we're hoping the rain clouds clear away a little bit, and we're going to take a look at routes and revenue, the path to profitability. We have the usual lineup of myself hosting the webinar. My name is Deirdre Fulton, and I'm happy to be here as ever. John Grant is also joining us this morning, so he's OAG's Chief Analyst. Welcome, John.
Hello, Deirdre. I'm happy to be here as well.
Good to hear it.
Last webinar of the winter season, isn't it? It's
summer season.
Summer season. Clocks go back. Schedules change on Sunday. Everyone misses their flights. It's been a busy 7 months for everyone, I think, and some of those aircraft will be looking for a bit of a rest over the next few weeks.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll hear more about that as we go on. We're also joined this morning by Paulos Lako. Good morning, Paulos. He's joining us from IATA this morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing fine, thank you.
Good. Paulos is Head of Industry Analysis at IATA in the Sustainability and Economics team, so is well versed in market analysis, economic research, and the work that IATA is doing around forecasting and supporting their members. So we're looking forward to hearing from Paulos this morning about his view on, and indeed IATA's view on what's happening in the industry right now. So let's dive in and see what we're going to cover today. So the subject matter, as we said, is about routes and revenues. And really this came from a feeling, a sense, a discussion that we've been having over the most of this year, actually, where we saw really strong surge in recovery in 2022 across the regions that had moved into recovery and had reopened. And we started to see fares going up. We obviously saw strong demand, and then that kind of coalesced with rising inflation, rises in interest rates, and a sort of sense that people were beginning to have less disposable income, and what was the impact of that going to be on travel once that sort of post-pandemic surge of recovery had happened. And we talked about, is the bubble going to burst? Will that surge slow down to become just a trickle? So really that's the sort of context of why we wanted to talk about this morning. And we're going to take a look at some data from IATA, some data from OAG, about how recovery continues to take place across various markets. And then we're going to take a look at some of the biggest routes on a revenue basis, and talk, hopefully, if we get time, about the importance of ancillary revenues. And I'm sure throughout the conversation we'll be peppered with the challenges that the industry is experiencing, both now in the summer season and as we go into the winter. So let's move on to our first slide. This is, if you're a usual member of our webinar guests, then you'll be familiar with this particular slide. And really we started this way back when the webinars began in the pandemic, as a means of what's happening in big picture in capacity terms. So this looks like a fairly positive picture. What you're looking at here is black 2019. You'll see we've dispensed on this slide with all the intervening years. But this is a really a positive picture. In October, we're seeing capacity just 1.6 below 2019. But of course, we can't ignore if things had gone on as normal and we hadn't had a pandemic, where might capacity actually have been now? And that's the green line at the top. We've also added the winter season, and that's the dotted line here. And you can see for the rest of this year, it's tracking pretty much similarly to where we are just now. And then we've had a look into the first quarter of 2024. It looks quite optimistic, John. Don't you agree?
Optimistic in the context of recovering back to 2019. Not
Just manage your expectations.
Yeah, not optimistic in terms of being where perhaps
No.
we would have expected to have been if we did a 5-year forecast.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's come back. But there are still those markets and those regions in the world that lag behind, and the pattern of capacity has changed considerably. I think the last 2 months, 3 months, everyone's been saying, well, come November, Chinese international travel is going to, be resurgent. We're going to be seeing lots more Chinese travelers, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Thailand and in Japan, and it's not materialized. And, if you look at capacity, I was at World Routes in Istanbul last week talking to some Chinese airports, and they were saying at very short notice, capacity was being switched back from international to domestic ahead of the seasonal holiday. So there was more domestic demand than international. So it's not a bad position by any stretch, and it's good that we are where we are. I would caution that we're going to see some capacity come out inevitably over the next 5 months. We always do. It's just the nature of the business. A couple of percentage points shaved here and there. We've got the spectre of the Pratt & Whitney engine issue that we'll discuss in more detail later that airlines are going to have to contend with. And of course, we've got the forever unknown certainty of what price fuel will be at. So, but I also, and I think this is interesting, I don't know how many times I've said this, every country had its own pandemic. And I sense that the US domestic market is beginning to soften a little in terms of demand, which is having an impact on yields and fares, of course. And, that's one part of the world where there's more capacity being added at the moment from the low-cost carriers. So it's
yeah.
The good news is, Deirdre, it always creates a story. There's something for Paulos and I to analyse every week.
Well, that's it. Always,
and keep us in a job. So it can carry on for as long as it wants. I'm not going to retire like Al Backer or any of the CEOs of the major
Good to hear. Good to hear. Just glad you've put that one out there. We might hold you to that. I think you can see, can't you, some of that optimism perhaps in the international capacity line, which looks like in Q1 next year it's going to be up at 2019 levels, and that feels a bit ambitious right now, doesn't it? Given that international capacity is still.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to predict. I mean, 2 weeks ago there was a survey in the UK where they were saying because the summer had been so lousy, and particularly July and August, that winter sun travel was extending into the first couple of weeks of November, with people heading to the Canaries and Greek islands. Well, good luck. It'll probably just be warmer rain there than it is here. So, I think there are so many different factors at play at this particular moment. It's hard to tell, but I generally think we'll still be slightly below 2018 capacity.
There's a John Grant prediction. Okay, let's move on to our next slide then, which is just to pick up on the point about China that you were making there. So, we can see really the strong growth in the domestic market that you were talking about.
Uh-huh.
It has continued really since reopening. So this is 2023 domestic capacity. And that's sort of back really to the sort of growth rates that we were seeing pre-pandemic in China's domestic market. Obviously, it's not the cumulative effect, of where it might have been, but it certainly is well into recovery. international, not so much, clearly. And this is a full year number, which obviously, you can sort of see the gradual effect of the sort of staged reopening of various international markets. We thought it might be interesting just to take a look at what the share was on international capacity operated by Chinese carriers versus foreign carriers. And actually in 2019, it was fairly close to being 50-50. Chinese carriers had a slightly higher share, but actually in 2023, it's higher. Chinese carriers full year operating 58% of capacity. But that there's a different story, as there always is, when you drill down into the detail and you look at the regional performance. And you can actually see here what we're showing is in the yellow line, 2023 share of capacity operated internationally by Chinese carriers versus what they operated in 2019. And you've got a market like the Southwest Pacific, which is largely Australia from China, hugely dominated by the Chinese carriers, and Europe also, a bigger share. North America actually is one of the markets where it declined, but there are sort of reasons for that we can come to. So I think an interesting dynamic, and a sort of question about, there are many things that are happening that will influence that as we go forward into the winter, or continue to influence that, aren't there?
There are. I mean, North America is the United States. There's a little bit to Canada, but it's generally the US. What we're seeing there, of course, is there was bilateral adjustments made during the pandemic, and they've been eased slightly in September and October. But whereas we were, perhaps at 250 weekly flights between North America and of the USA and China, we're probably only still at about 20, maybe 30% of where we were before. And that's not going to change for the rest of the winter, I suspect. And if it did change, the net benefactors would be the Chinese airlines, who may add services from those tier 2 cities of 16 million, 20 million populations that are not served at the moment. It's the big 3 destinations that are being served. And then you look at Australia, where, there's been improvements in diplomatic relations. Some of the tension's been eased, and there's literally a 10-fold increase in capacity. But the other I think one of the other characteristics that we're seeing is, so we're seeing destinations being returned to and from China internationally, but we're not seeing the rebuild of frequency as quickly as perhaps we expected. And in parallel with that, we're not actually seeing the same types of aircraft being operated. So we're seeing less capacity per movement. The big A380s that were perhaps being operated by some of the Chinese airlines are not being used, and some of them are indeed up for retirement. So it's a changing picture. And in Thailand, we were talking about Thailand, China on the last webinar we had with Gary Bauman, and Thai Tourist Board were looking for 5 million Chinese visitors by year end. They're now readjusted their number to 4 million because it's just not happening. Similarly, in Japan, they're not seeing the levels of tourists that they expected. So it's everyone's still going to be waiting for China. It's just what it is, and until that changes, we are where we are.
Panos, I was going to ask you exactly your views on this. It's an important market for your members too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, in terms of changing picture, just going back to May, we had done a brief analysis on looking at the inbound international capacity to China. And, things were picking up with after the reopening, and some of those travel restrictions being lifted as well. And we had seen quite a quick uptick in inbound capacity. And looking at that trajectory, we had expected by September, we'd be around 63% recovered in terms of daily inbound flights. So that's adding about from that starting point about 95 flights per day, and that hasn't unfortunately panned out. We're more around 53% recovered on those international flights through the 24th of September. And I think there are quite a lot of macro drivers at play as well that have slowed down the recovery there since we had been looking at it from the first quarter of 2023. We've seen a big rise in the youth unemployment rate in China, and a considerable slowdown in their property market. These factors have definitely impacted the international demand from into China as well.
And it's not just passenger, is it? I mean, cargo, which China is one of the major producers of air cargo, that's pretty depressed as well.
Yeah, and that we had seen the new export orders, some of the forward indicators that we track for export orders slowing down quite a bit in May and June, so that it's no surprise that cargo demand has also been on a slowing trajectory.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that actually what we've seen in recovery, I suppose perhaps naively, or perhaps the optimists in us wanted to see a similar recovery pattern as took place in other parts of the world. That surge of travel, everything reopening, and people embracing the ability to get on a plane and go somewhere, having been locked in. But it feels like there's a different pattern happening in China, and as you've said, there are macro economic factors at play. There's the geography of a country where there's a tourism product domestically. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it, for all of those tourism bodies and destinations all around Southeast Asia, it is a challenging winter ahead, isn't there? Just in terms of trying to understand and preempt what ability they have to stimulate the outbound Chinese market to come back, and to what extent those kind of factors that are at play domestically in China may impact on that. So yeah, it's not clear cut, I think, and it certainly still feels more like a stream than a river.
I that's not going to change this side of February.
Yeah.
Until you get to Chinese New Year, it's likely that the demand we're seeing now is going to remain the demand we're seeing. Will the economy pick up? Will those indicators turn around and begin to look a bit more positive? Well, it takes time, and it's not going to happen overnight, and that's why you don't see the capacity being added back in by the international airlines. They're moderately cautious, I think, and many of them have found other things to do with their aircraft, or have other resources and challenges that they need to think about. So it is what it is, and that's why you may think I'm being a bit pessimistic. I don't think we'll quite get back to 2018/19 with some of the events that are going on.
Yeah, and that I guess that was always the sense, wasn't it? That this was always going to be a long sustained recovery, and whether it was 24, 25, or indeed 26 for some markets was were always the questions that we were asking.
And China obviously is crucial, and it's important for many other markets who depend on it. But let's not beat ourselves up about the recovery in terms of other parts of the world that are doing really well. So North America and the domestic markets have been good for quite some time. Central Asia If you look at capacity there, it's 30% up what it was in 2019, and all of the STAN countries are growing rapidly. India, the subcontinent, all of those markets, a lot of strength there as well. In Europe, it's been a very strong summer with not enough infrastructure to cope with some of the issues that we faced. So it's, yes, you can talk to your heart's content about China, but there are good parts of the business and some outstanding profitability as well.
Okay, let's take a look at some of those domestic markets that we were talking about. What we've done here is we've pulled out the 5 biggest domestic markets and just looked at their position. This is just October, this October versus October 19. And there will be a point, we say this every webinar and we don't ever quite manage it, but maybe it's a 2024 thing where we stop talking about 2019. But I'm as guilty of it as everyone else. And Pelos, I think we talked about this last week, didn't we? That the need for the baseline comparison is always going to be there. I think maybe until we get out of the other side of full recovery everywhere and into growth. But anyway, there's my explanation for still having 2019 in there. I think that's what we saw. Certainly in terms of the domestic trend line on the first series of charts we showed you, strong typical growth in the USA this month, although we'll come back to your concerns maybe in a little while, John. Japan and Brazil lagging a bit. I know Brazil has particularly high inflation at the minute. And I think Japan, has not had a similar recovery to the USA, for example, in terms of its domestic market. If we then look across the regions, there's some outliers, which we probably could have anticipated some of them. We've seen strong growth in Mexico throughout and Colombia. Canada has tailed behind, particularly behind its neighbour, just in terms of getting back to that 2019 level. Oh, apologies. Feedback. I'm not sure why that is. Bear with me. Asia Pacific. Again, there's sort of different stories going on here, but the biggest market, Indonesia, still almost 25%, so 23% below 2019 levels. Thailand similarly lagging behind domestically. We've seen a shift from Vietnam, which actually I think had international capacity repurposed into the domestic market during the pandemic. That's now changed, and things are sort of back down below 2019 again. And then over to Europe, we've got different things going on there. Spain, where somebody was telling me a couple of weeks ago that there's been a real focus on getting back to the office, getting people back into away from working at home. So the domestic market there is doing really well. Similarly, strong capacity in Italy's domestic market, and you've got a different dynamic happening in Germany and to some extent in France. So I think if you'd asked, and there's almost enough in here, isn't there, just to have a whole webinar on
every one of these.
Unpicking some of that. Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, if you'd asked us a year ago, 18 months ago, what this profile would look like, would we have anticipated this? I'm not sure.
I mean, Mexico, if you take it, all of those, and China, we would have perhaps thought that would come back down again. US market, we know there's more capacity going in there because we've got the low-cost airlines who are adding more capacity. You know, they've taken a lot of aircraft deliveries in the last 18 months. Mexico was always ahead of the curve on the pandemic. Canada, quite frankly, has been a basket case of how to handle the pandemic. And I think every Canadian citizen is so frustrated at how they were locked down. I think they had second longest lockdown of all countries. So no surprise there. We're also seeing some change in travel pattern, operational patterns in Canada, where we're seeing what were transcontinental 767 wide-body aircraft being replaced by A220s. So tells you something about the market, and obviously
it does, doesn't it? Gosh, that's quite a shift.
Reduction, but also, you know, allows the airlines to squeeze the yield that extra couple of percentage points, actually more than a few percentage points, and they've done that very well. And then if you look at Saudi Arabia, I think that's fascinating. That is, the domestic market is down by 11%. This is the country that has the Saudi 2030 vision. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of people, consultants flooding into the country building these tourism products. And yet their domestic market at this point, against some ambitions for 2030, is 11% down. You know, it seems to me that there's a massive disconnect at this moment between capacity and what the reality is and what the vision is. And it needs to be thought about. You know, it's ambitious. If they achieve half of it, it would be amazing. But at the moment, I think they're just adrift in their thinking of where they are and what the opportunity is. So that's fascinating. And West Africa, Nigeria, that interestingly has been very strong throughout the whole of the pandemic. West African capacity, new entrants, more demand. It's been really strong. South Africa is because South African Airways collapsed, but they're coming back slowly. You could write a blog on every one of these countries, and you know, you'd have interesting content. Germany, well, Germany is just, everyone at World Routes was just rolling their eyes last week about the German market and what's happened domestically. Indeed, there was a lot of concern amongst the European airports and airlines at the event about, you know, the move for sustainability, the imposition of rules and regulations, and the disconnect between what their governments and regulators are saying and insisting upon, and what the industry is telling them they can and cannot do, and how quickly they're moving. People are going to lose their jobs, I think, because of what's happened. You know, look at somewhere like Amsterdam. This winter, they're talking about 4 or 5% less frequency to comply with the noise and the environmental issues, and another 4 or 5% next year. And we were talking to Wilco, who's been on some of these webinars from Schiphol Airport, and we were saying, well, airlines can up gauge. They can go from a 320 or 319 to a 321, or maybe some of them can go to wide-bodied movements. And he was saying it just doesn't fill the gap. It just doesn't work. You know, you can't turn a 321 round in 35 minutes where you can do with the 319. You might not have a wide-bodied stand available. And if you do, that means, you know, you're going to have to increase the turnaround time. If that aircraft is a typically high proportion of connecting traffic back to a hub airport, then that's going to miss its connecting blocks and banks and all of these sort of things. The implications of what's happening at the moment, the knock-ons are just all over the place. And sadly, the regulators are not working with the industry in many cases to achieve what they want.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the demand side. You know, domestic demand, we've seen that come back much quicker than international due to the earlier reopening of and lifting of restrictions in various domestic markets. And you know, since April, at least for how we track domestic demand in terms of revenue passenger kilometers, we've seen RPKs remain above 2019 levels quite consistently. In August, I think we had them at around 9.2% above pre-pandemic levels. And the U.S. market has been interesting to track because, obviously we've seen them recover earlier than other countries during the pandemic in terms of their domestic market. And as we started to see, the pandemic savings running out for U.S. consumers, a few months back, we had concerns that we would start to see some weakening trends in demand, and what we actually started to see is a shift towards international flights when you're looking at the U.S. Travelers, and even despite that, I think we still see domestic demand has recovered quite well in that it's maintained its levels above 2019 levels, even after that shift that we noticed in the U.S. travelers.
I think there's a residual effect, isn't there, that we're seeing, perhaps particularly in the US, in a certain demographic where it's almost not it's not just revenge travel. It's a new shift into this is a lifestyle, in terms of I'm working more flexibly, I've got more control, I've got less expenditure, perhaps house purchases are being deferred for people in that mid 20s to mid 30s category, and travel is being prioritized. It's travel. It appears that travel has almost become an essential rather than a luxury item, and I think that to some extent explains some of that ongoing strength in demand, doesn't it? Particularly internationally, and whether we'll look back and say that was a short term in terms of 2 to 3 year effect, or an actual shift. I guess we just don't know yet, do we? In terms of what that's going to look like.
Well, I've got no doubt that's what's happening in Europe. With interest rates escalating, people are not being able to get on the housing or buy their own properties. They've got a bit more disposable income, or they've kept disposable income slightly longer than they thought they had. Maybe they've dipped into what they were saving as deposits for property, etc., and they're still travelling. And is that a structural change? Well, it's one of those things we don't really know until 2 or 3 years have passed.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to now. We've got some slides from Paulos to talk about. I'm going to go to this view, which hopefully we can see these. So Paulos, this one is your first slide, which looks at Q2 2023 against the previous year, which in some markets was sort of the point that we look back and say, yes, that's when people really started to travel again, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's really highlighting 2023 overall has been a year that we've seen strong growth, but it's also to highlight that we've seen it in really a wide range of markets, both on the domestic and international side. So in overall in Q2 that we're showing here for 2023 versus the previous year, we saw year-on-year increase of nearly 30%, and that brought total traffic, both domestic and demand, to be within about 3.5% of 2019 levels. We'll get the Q3 numbers soon. So, but broadly speaking, we'd expect similar trends in Q3 as well. And here we've broken them out into market segments by distance, and you can see that the domestic growth, which is highlighted in red in the red bars, was up about 2.5% from 2019 levels, and on the international side, which is what we show in the blue bars, you can see that we've had about 36% year-on-year growth across all the markets. But despite this strong growth, a lot of it which is coming from a lower base, as you can see in those long haul markets on the right hand side.
Yeah.
We're still about 11.5% below 2019 levels of O&D passenger traffic. So in the coming slides, we'll see a recovery picture, but I think we can also use this slide to highlight some of the trends that John mentioned in terms of growth in the domestic markets for China. If you look at some of those market distances that are between 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers, that's where we saw the strongest domestic growth in the second quarter. And that's essentially reflecting some of those strong domestic markets in China. Your Shanghai to Beijing, also Shanghai to Guangzhou. Those all fall in that distance group. And I think maybe Juju had mentioned the strong domestic tourism push, which we saw also playing out since the beginning of the second half of 2023.
Okay.
So if we go to the next slide, actually,
Yep.
I think this illustrates a really interesting picture in terms of recovery to pre-pandemic levels. And again, we're using 2019 as our baseline. So looking at 2023 quarter two against 2019 quarter two, here we've separated domestic recovery on the left from international recovery on the right. And it's interesting to see kind of the some of the divergent trends and the uneven recovery in these two big market groups. And you can see for the domestic side, most markets had fully recovered in the second quarter of 2023, while when you look at international markets on the right hand side, across all distance groups, they've remained well below 2019 levels. And what's interesting to highlight is some of the within the domestic market, also some of the differences we can note when you look at that 500 kilometer plus markets. Most of those medium haul and to long haul markets have fully recovered. With the strongest recoveries we're seeing being in the 1,000 to 2,000 kilometer market groups. Those were above 2019 levels by around 8%. And again, this is reflecting some of the recovery and growth trends that we saw in domestic China. But you can see kind of the outlier in the domestic market seems to be that 500 kilometer and less distance group, where we've seen also the slowest growth in Q2. It was around 13%, as I showed on the previous slide. And this is also the distance group that's lagging behind 2019 levels. As you can see here, it's about 7.8% below Q2 2019 levels, or roughly 8 million passengers short of those levels. So it's interesting to ask, what's the reason behind this? Are we seeing some mode switching happening, air to rail, or is there loss of demand, for these short haul markets due to changing business travel behavior? And how does this play out by region? So these are some of the questions we have. We haven't gotten to the whys yet, but these are the questions we want to tackle as we move forward.
And Paulos, presumably that -8 in the domestic market up to the 500 kilometer range. Have you managed to identify how much of that is Germany, how much of that is France? Because those sort of stick out to me as the immediate areas where you think there will have been an impact.
Not quite. What we've done at the region level still hasn't really spliced the data to look at domestic and international, but we are doing that. And indeed, that's one of our suspicions also, is that where you have these new flight bans and also some of those changes in travel behavior for business trips. Those are the markets where we expect this slower recovery for domestic demand.
Is the day trip sort of corporate travel? It isn't it? I mean, I think it's all of those things that we've said, you know, in terms of mode switching. I think there's changes in working patterns. I think there's perhaps the effect of the significant operational disruption that we saw last summer and that we still see, we still have seen periodically this year, in terms of, if I'm only going for a day, and the prospect that my flight will either be cancelled at short notice, or I'll be stuck for 3 hours, or, you know, I'll be stuck somewhere and can't get back. All of that weighs heavy on the scale of, do I really need to do that day trip to, you know?
Yeah. Well, you could sit on Virgin Trains, or what was Virgin Trains.
Let's not talk about the UK rail system
for 3 hours waiting outside a railway station.
Just
but I think,
know that
I think it is
better.
a valid point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Typically those shorter domestic type sectors had relatively high degrees of frequency, even if you account for Qantas apparently running ghost flights for a long time during the summer. You know, and therefore, when there is any issue about resources, ATC, whatever it happens to be, what are the flights that get hit first? And it's the short haul domestic type markets that get impacted. Sometimes because there's a competitor, you can get switched across, whatever it happens to be. One of the things we haven't done, which would be interesting at OAG, is actually look at cancellations by sector length. That would be quite interesting as well, to see what impact that's having on this, because it does change consumers' mindset. It does make you think, I'll go by rail, whatever it happens to be, or you just do a Zoom call or Teams.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you bring up, John. When you think about Europe, what we've noticed and in our connectivity analysis is for most of second half of 22 and the first half of 23, what we've seen is the breadth of the connectivity coming back very well. You know, especially with your LCCs, the Wizz Airs and such, expanding into southeastern Europe and such. We've seen the breadth of the connectivity really recovering quite strongly and exceeding 2019 levels. But what we're still missing is that frequency, and that could be reflecting some of the slower recovery we're seeing in demand as well for those domestic markets.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the whole thing about connections and all of the six freedom flows, I think at the moment you'd be a lunatic if you went on Expedia and you saw a connection that said a 1 hour transit somewhere, or a 3 hour transit. You'd be a loony to take the 1 hour transit, wouldn't you? I mean, you just know that you're setting yourself up not to get there for whatever reason. And we've got to start thinking about this a bit more rationally as an industry. You know, what are minimum connecting times? And I know at Heathrow, from January, the MCTs are being pushed further out to accommodate and take some of the pressure off some of those connecting flows. And when we looked at it, there was little or no difference to the connectivity that was being created. You know, it was just unnecessary pressure being put on the system.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because for a long time pre-pandemic, you know, there were markets that airlines were very much chasing in terms of being competitive, not just on price but on connecting time. So, you know, to see that shift and change is a whole other subject, isn't it?
But it's a can of worms. Don't go there, because why did British Airways sell me a fare from Amsterdam to Chicago that is 40% cheaper than if I buy the local fare from London Heathrow? So I then buy a flight with EasyJet from Gatwick to Amsterdam, have a coffee with Wilco, who's still trying to find me some football tickets, and then ultimately fly back to Heathrow to continue my journey. I mean, it's mindless, isn't it? You know, sustainability. Let's charge.
John, that sounds like single-handedly you're trying to address that 0 to 500 gap.
I am. Yeah, I am.
Okay. I'm slightly mindful of time, so let's move on to the next slide. I'll go back to the slide deck. Okay, so Pilas, what are we looking at here? So what does it all mean, I think?
Yeah, it's addressing maybe John's question halfway. When we do look at the regions, taking the regional view by region of origin for these passenger markets, we see that very short haul market below 500 kilometers. They're actually quite behind across these top three regions: Asia Pacific, Europe, North America. And the top right hand side in the top chart, we see that the passenger traffic is behind for these regions for that market group. And in the lower chart, you see the airline revenues for this distance group, but it's also below pre-pandemic levels, which is marked by that horizontal dashed line, representing the 2019 level of passengers in the top chart and revenues in the bottom. But when we look at the short haul market between 500 to 1500 kilometer range, which actually is the largest market group for O&D passengers in Asia Pacific as well as Europe, and you can use that small chart on the left hand side as a reference for that. You can see that this short haul market has actually nearly recovered to pre-pandemic levels across these three primary regions, and we can also see that the revenues for Europe and North American markets for this distance group have actually risen above pre-pandemic levels by about 10%. And if we move further to the right with the medium haul markets, those between 1,500 and 4,000 kilometers, which is the biggest market for the North American region, that distance group, we can see that they've almost recovered in terms of passenger traffic, O&D passenger traffic, but have grown well above 2019 levels in terms of revenue. So, this is an implication that, we've seen average fares rise particularly faster for these distance groups, or yields more specifically, since we're looking at it at the level of these distance groups. And we've seen these yields increase above pre-pandemic levels for this market. So, for the U.S., this group, distance group, is reflecting those trunk routes connecting big cities like Los Angeles and New York at the far end, and then at the shorter end, looking at New York, Miami type of markets in the U.S.
But I mean, we need to be careful how we interpret this, though, don't we? Because there'll be people on this webinar and there are journalists who join us who will say, wow, that means there's a 25% improvement in yield in North America in that 1,500 to 4,000 kilometer sector length. And that's absolutely right, there is. But let's also be mindful that the cost of operating are also significantly higher than they were in 2019, and not just the vulnerability of price of fuel, but also things like labor cost. All of the major US carriers, pilots, Teamsters unions have got some sweetheart 25-30% salary increase incentive deals in place at the moment. So the operating costs have increased as well as the revenues. So yes, profitability has increased, there's no doubt about that, and it's still appallingly low by most industry standards, the return on capital employed, and it's a good year. And as someone said to me recently, if you can't make money as an airline this year, whenever will you make money? So there might be many airlines wondering, whenever will we make money? But it's there are other aspects to this. It's not just purely the revenue. There is the cost dimension as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And we had a slight variation of this chart to kind of highlight that. And that's where we looked at, essentially adjusting the revenues to real terms, so adjusting for inflation. And that really does paint a different picture, because indeed prices have gone up. We use consumer price index for that adjustment, but you could use producer price indices as well, and you would see that indeed the actual increase in revenues or profitabilities would be much more attenuated than what we are showing just by the nominal increase here.
Okay. Right. Thank you for that, Paulos. Let's move on to our next slide, which I guess attempts to go a layer below some of that information and looks at, so we've got the first half of 2019 versus the first half of 2023, so January to June. We've pulled out the largest routes by revenue. And with that sort of caveat, I guess, John, that you mentioned, on the face of it, it looks like some significant increases in revenues, but we're not showing the cost piece here. And I guess what we were interested to look at was, to what extent were we seeing increases in revenues being driven by passenger volume increases or capacity volume increases. And then just for out of curiosity, I suppose, I added the distance to these to see if any of these kind of match up with what you're seeing, Paulos, in the data. What I think is interesting is, in terms of the actual routes themselves, 6 of these are domestic, so 3 of those US ones that you were talking about in terms of the longer city to city ones. There are 2 Australian ones in here, and then 1 in Saudi, which obviously, we talked earlier about the Saudi domestic picture. And there's another interesting dimension here. If you look at the one which has had the biggest increase in revenue, it's actually Dubai to Riyadh, which, when you think about the volume of activity that's underway and the level of business traffic that's going backwards and forwards between those 2 countries at the minute, it wasn't a particular surprise to me to see that. So that one almost kind of bucks the trend in terms of it's a sort of shorter distance, but there's a local dynamic in the market going on that I think is pushing up fares there. If you take that through to a sort of average fare, then you're talking about it going from something like somewhere in the region of $250 to about $1,000, and that's kind of consistent with, anecdotally, what people are telling us that sort of market is looking like. So I think there's some interesting things potentially to unpick there. Interested in your thoughts, John, on this.
Well, I mean, no great surprise. I mean, ultimately, we know airfares around the world are much higher, and you see that in this table here on a selection of routes. And you've picked out 10. We could look at 20, 50. We'd see the same picture. It's interesting that there are quite a few domestic ones in there, because traditionally they've been the lower yielding ones. But in Australia, it wasn't just the country that was locked down; each individual state was locked down. So you've got more of a recovery going on there. The Dubai Riyadh phenomena is just incredible. I mean, you can't buy a seat for love or money on a Thursday evening to fly from Riyadh or Saudi Arabia to Dubai. And if you look at some of the booking data, the creative ways people are moving between those 2 countries at the moment for what is only a 900-mile sector, is quite incredible, really. But that will change over time.
Yeah, and my initial impression was also, when you look at some of the long haul markets, where we anecdotally hear a lot of reports on really exorbitant increases in airfares. What I found quite useful is, as I showed on the previous slide, that those markets tend to be somewhat smaller in terms of their traffic base for those regions as well. So it's good to have that in context to see, well, really how many passengers are being impacted by these very large increases in fares. So I think it's quite interesting once you start to see the developments at the market segment level or the distance level. It really starts to paint a clear picture of which areas are being.
To Paulus's comment, I mean, let's not forget 6 months ago, people were complaining about a $10,000 economy class ticket from United Airlines to China from the West Coast of the US because there was so little capacity that, that was the price in the market. And sometimes it works against you, doesn't it? Because if the demand is relatively weak, then airlines actually inversely revenue manage and actually look for the highest possible yield from the fewest traveling customers possible, because they know that they can't stimulate the market for whatever reason.
Yeah. Okay, I'm conscious we've got a couple more slides we'd like to show, so we will skip through those fairly quickly because we're approaching the end of our time this morning. Very quickly, because there are 2 more slides after this that we want to get to. This was just a note of interest, I think, about the importance of ancillary revenues. Cartrawler and IdeaWorks published their annual ancillary revenue report, which is always an interesting take on what airlines are reporting in terms of ancillary revenues. And you can see there we've included the table of the top 10 airlines by ancillary revenues. They note in the report that passenger traffic between 22 and 21, obviously this is based on full year financial results, which we don't yet have in 2023. Passenger traffic up by 43%, revenues up by 65%, but ancillary revenues not growing as quickly as overall revenues, which I guess you'd expect if fares have been increasing. What I thought was interesting, and this is probably again a subject for another day, is taking the results from the Cartrawler report. I just took an average of what the ancillary revenue per passenger was across the regions for the carriers that are included in the report, which are a representative sample of 65 or so airlines. And these differentials are really interesting. This is unbundling of fares in action, isn't it?
I think there's a couple of things we need to be a little bit mindful of. I'm not sure. Does the North American revenue include the credit card revenue that the airlines generate as part
I think it does. Yes, I think.
Well, that's huge on its own. That's absolutely huge. I mean, it's reached the point where I think during the pandemic, that credit card income kept the airlines in a cash-rich position for a period of time. And it's not replicated in any other part of the world, maybe a little bit in Australia with Qantas. But if you could get that $19 in Asia and South Pacific up to, an average, which is about 28, perhaps, there's a lot of revenue that is potentially being left on the table or could be created. But I keep going back to something I've mentioned so many times before. Airlines and analysts have got to stop looking at average yield, ASKs and things like that, and they've got to look at revenue per seat and yield per seat, because that's the metric that's going to become increasingly important as we unbundle all of these various elements of the business. What is the airline generating per seat? That's the most important criteria, I think, going forward. And of course, what the cost of that seat is.
Thank you for that, John. Very quickly, our last, we might get to the last one too. Our second last slide is just really a flag about there are significant headwinds this winter. We were asked a question at the very beginning of the webinar about the impact of geopolitical issues. And the reality is they continue to affect your travel and demand for your travel in the way they always have done. You know, I thought this was an interesting chart, which is produced by Vision of Humanity, and it's a global peace index, which just gives a visual representation of where there is peace and where there is conflict.
And I think, Deirdre, the intro, going back to where we began an hour ago talking about China, one of the difficulties of China is, you know, its geographic location, the inability for many airlines at the moment to fly over, through, or near Russian airspace.
Yeah,
means that, you know, it adds so much more cost to their operation, and not just fuel, but also people and resource. You know, heavy crews operating from Tokyo and from Beijing back to London, four crew members rather than two. That's a missed flight somewhere else that could have been operated.
and that's the impact, isn't it? In terms of, it's not just people choosing not to fly necessarily because the flights are longer and the fares are more expensive as a result. There's the other side, you know, in terms of the operational impacts on airlines, and clearly, you know, we've got disruption and instability in Central and West Africa. There's the Israel-Palestine conflict. All of these things are going to impact airlines going into this winter, aren't they?
Yeah.
Very last slide. We talked about this. You talked about this at the outset, John. This is going to be a real issue for airlines this winter, isn't it?
Yeah, just I mean, you know, it's an expensive exercise, this Pratt & Whitney engine problem for the airlines in terms of planning, bringing forward maintenance, finding someone to do the maintenance and to do the checks as required. It affects many airlines around the world in different regional markets. And, you know, there's been an assessment that could mean up to 250 aircraft grounded over the winter. And if you just crudely take an average of 160 seats, then, you know, on a per day basis, that works out about 160,000 fewer seats in the market over the winter program, which is 140 days, and a very, very conservative low yield of $150 per passenger. That's about 2.78 billion of revenue the airline industry is going to lose. Which might be a bit of a problem for Pratt & Whitney because we've just identified how much the airlines are going to be coming to you for, and probably some more. Yeah, it's a problem for the industry. It's an even bigger problem for Pratt & Whitney, I think.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think just adding on to those cost pressures, I just wanted to mention on the from the previous slide also, those geopolitical issues are going to have an implication on the oil price itself, and that's something that you know, with those extra operational factors, I think we're going to see more cost pressures for the airlines.
And I saw a forecast from Bloomberg, who do some pretty good analysis. They estimated the impact for United Airlines of the current situation in Tel Aviv and suspension of services is a $738 million revenue hit if it projects forward. So, you know, that's just one example. And yet, at the same time, Cyprus Airways are in the market for two A321s at short notice because they see opportunity for accessing traffic that wants to get to that part of the world.
Yeah. Okay, I think unfortunately, as ever, we're out of time. There's always never quite enough time for these conversations, and I think we've identified probably enough content to keep us going for at least another 6 months. Pavlos, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights. They've been really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
Sparked some interesting thought for us in terms of further analysis, I suspect. John, thank you also for joining us. and we will see you back here later this afternoon. Pylos, you're off the hook, but thanks very much for joining us, and thanks to everybody for listening in. You will get a copy of the recording if you've had to leave, and the slide deck will be available also later from OEG.
Okay.
Okay, thanks
Thanks everyone. Cheers.